Bank of Finland for giving the opportunity to present the paper here. And I also actually like the idea to have, instead of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, because usually I go over the time, and hopefully not today. So I will present a paper on household behavior or household choices, consumption, financial, and how these are related to the inflation that they experience. And I have two co-authors here from University of Zurich, and Christoph Basten and Toczynski. So we started the research idea already a couple of years ago, before the latest episode of inflation. And then I had to convince myself and also the others why we should look at inflation and how households respond to inflation, because that was not that relevant at low inflation period. So now I don't have to have more extra slides about why to look at the inflation and topic. So we can do it now, and we realize that it is important to understand what is going on and what are different mechanisms that are at work there. So what I am focusing here is on the household behavior or household choices and how they respond to inflation in terms of consumption, but also in terms of saving or borrowing, financial choices. And we also look at the inflation that they experience themselves. It's not about headline inflation, but they experience inflation. So two key words. One is about this household level or individual level inflation. There are more papers and more discussion now coming up about the topic that it is the headline inflation is sort of like representative household and a representative basket, but not all households do consume the same goods and do have the same consumption basket. So there is also more understanding that actually the inflation that households experience can be quite different. That when you say that the target is 2% of headline inflation, but some households can experience low inflation and some can experience high inflation. And there can be quite large difference in several percentage points even. So there are a couple of papers that are focusing or emphasizing this aspect, and also I would point to the Google think tank that started to observe or calculate the heterogeneity inflation of different inflation rates for different groups of households, and they do it especially for this new episodes of inflation. And one can see that there are differences for several percentage points or even larger for different groups. So one is about inflation heterogeneity, and the other one is about consumption. So why should we look at the experienced inflation and consumption, although in the, let's say, in the models we talk about inflation expectations. So and we say also that we see that yes, when we talk about the current inflation, then this is linked to the expectation channel. That we expect that people or individuals, households, respond to with the consumption because the current inflation is also related to their expectations. In which ways? If we think that they are fully rational and forward-looking, they anticipate that the inflation that they experience next period will be higher than this period, then they will increase the consumption in the initial period, and when the prices increase for them, they will adjust. So that is intertemporal allocation. And this is something that we would like to think when we talk about inflation expectations and how households respond. So coming to the other, but how inflation expectations are formed. If these are adaptive, meaning that when households think what will be the inflation, then they look at what is the inflation or the price changes that they have experienced right now. And when they have experienced that, see that prices are increasing, they also say that the inflation will increase, that they're expecting the inflation or prices to increase further. So, and there are several papers there which are also looking at it and finding that indeed that these, especially these grocery or everyday prices that actually matter, and what households are using when they form their expectations. So if we think that it is about adaptive expectations, then the relationship between the experienced inflation and the consumption could be positive, not negative when we think about the fully rational forward-looking households. So while I'm taking this in here, then I will give a hint about the results that we see is indeed that we see that there is a positive relationship. There are also other channels that are at work. We could think about the income effect or wealth effect and how inflation is affecting the real income or real wealth. Also about the uncertainty which could be related to the inflation. So there are different channels at work. What we admit that we are not disentangled different channels here, but we will look at the net effect, and we do see and relate our results to the expectation channels. So what do? We use microdata. We want to see that the link between the inflation, individual or household level inflation, and what is the change in consumption there, whether there is any link. Thinking also that one can control for the headline inflation. So we use standard consumption model where we know that income is an important factor that drives the consumption change. Wealth is the one, and then we say we control for the main factors. We also then see whether the individual inflation there matters. How we estimate the individual inflation or how this can be done is when one knows the consumption categories or consumption basket, and one knows also how the prices are changing. Then it is possible that to estimate for each individual their own inflation. When the consumption or on good level or product level is not available, which is sort of like this typical problem, then another aggregation is that one can also look at the consumption baskets or categories and taking a little bit broader look, not so detailed product level look, but also category look. And indeed, there are also that the product categories, the share of product categories is different for different households. So when one knows what is the product proportion of different products or categories, one knows what is the price index or for the specific or for this specific category, one can actually calculate the individual price index and from this one individual inflation. So we use data from early periods, as I mentioned, that we started with this idea already before the last episode of inflation, but in many countries, the inflation was sort of like very low environment for the last decades since the global financial crisis. But we picked Estonia because for this country, we also see before the last incident, actually, that the inflation rates are quite varying. So this is the country where we could take some additional insights about the changes in inflation. There has also been the yearly inflation over 10% in 2007. We also use Estonia as a case study here because it's a small open economy where the majority or the most push for the inflation comes from exogenous shocks. So that there are some papers that say that show that in small open economies, the inflation is more driven by external shocks. And using microdata means also that we can control for unobserved individual effects and also common aggregate shocks, meaning that we can also control for the headline inflation and then see whether the individual inflation matters. So, and when we talk about the general, the headline inflation here, saying that high volatility, then also going to the subgroups, different categories, we also see that there is quite varying, and they don't, the variation dynamics is not synchronized, so that it is, they can move in different directions, which also means that when the consumption baskets for households are different, then the dynamics for the inflation can be also rather different because depending on which categories experience the largest change in the prices and which ones have the largest share in the consumption basket. So what we are doing, we are using microdata, as I said. We are using account level data set to get more frequent data. So from one commercial bank in Estonia, which covers almost like 12% of the population. So it's quite large data set. Quarterly data from 2005 to 2011. So quite early period, but as I say, that there is large volatility in this period as well. Why not later periods? Because this is the period we have the detail. I have also used this data for some other previous research questions, and then it was good hands to also to go and address this question. So transaction data, what does it contain? It contains the outflows and the inflows from the transaction or from bank accounts. From those ones, after cleaning, looking at the data, extracting some of these transactions which cannot be considered as income or spending, but from these ones we can get the proxies for income and spending variables. There are also balances for different accounts, like checking accounts, term deposits, and also investment accounts, so that we can split the type of savings, and also the balances of loans, so that we can also look at the different types of loans or dig into these accounts. And some socioeconomic characteristics that are also useful there. As the transaction data, in that sense, it's good that it's quarterly data, 7 years, so we could really go to the balance dimension and look how households are responding over the time. But it doesn't contain the inflation data there. But what we do here is that we are imputing it using the household budget survey. So this is sort of like instrumenting exercise, meaning that we use household budget survey which has very detailed data on consumption shares. So we impute the consumption shares from those ones here using the common characteristics that are available in the household budget survey and in the transaction data. And then we impute the consumption shares in the transaction data using these common characteristics. So sort of like instrumenting approach. And what we do is impute, meaning that we know that the fraction or the weight proportion of the different categories is equal to 1. We can use nominal fraction model to estimate the weights in the household budget survey, and then use these estimates to impute it in the transactional data. So, and just technical detail that we go for the constant weights, meaning that we are estimating from one data set to the other one the weights to be constant. We know that these vary over the period, but constant weights we would like to use because we have also the second step there, that we want to look at the consumption, and we want to make sure that the changes in the inflation are mainly only due to the changes in the prices, not in the consumption shares. So this is sort of like a proxy for going to the next step. Of course, one could go more detailed and get a better idea about the changes in the individual inflation when one would also let the consumption weights to vary. But because of the next step, we want to keep these constant. So what we do, as I already said, yes, we estimate a nominal fractional model and use the estimated coefficients to impute the weights, so that when we know the weights and we also have the category CPIs, we can estimate the CPI for each individual in the transaction data and calculate, get the individual inflation. So because of this imputation, okay, so yeah, some of this text is so you don't see somewhere it's hidden there. Because of this imputation technique, in principle, what we are looking or we are getting is group-specific inflation. Yeah, so not to the individual, so granular level, but on the group level. So we sort of like getting how much the characteristics that we are using to impute this means that we all have more or less like 400 groups there that we for which we have the inflation. So this is let's say some average there. We lose granularity there. But probably we also lose some measurement error there because when we were also considering instead of imputation, just import, if we have these 400 groups, to import the average inflation in these groups to the other data set, then we also saw that in some groups the number of observations is quite small, meaning that there might be more measurement error there. And the imputation or the model approach is more appropriate there. So first it's about the result, showing the outcome of this imputation exercise, or what is the inflation that we get. In the transaction data, comparing with the headline inflation that is rate, and then this mean imputed inflation in the transaction data, and then in the quartile for this range there. And we do follow quite closely the headline inflation, meaning that the dynamics is the same. It doesn't need to be, as I said, that we are using the fixed weight, so that actually the dynamics might be larger, but but we do get very similar dynamics there. But we have also done a lot of robustness because of this first step to see how robust the second step estimations are, how we do the first step. And the heterogeneity here, although the main focus is not on the heterogeneity, but it is just a warm-up picture here. And this is about the year. So we are estimating the quarterly because we have quarterly data, and we have a quarter model for quarterly data. But just to get the idea of heterogeneity there, then yes, indeed, we see that the median, but also how big are the differences between across these 400 groups. They are up to 4 or 3.2 percentage points. So the average is 1.8 over the period. And we know that this is not full heterogeneity. It's just because we are using group means, so it's sort of group. But probably when we will go to the individual, the differences will be larger. And if one would also go to the product level, not on category level, then the differences would be even larger. So this is just a small first step to understand that even on that level, we get quite big differences over the period. Let's say because 1.8 percentage point means that somebody's having 1%, but somebody else has 2.8. So that and if we think that the target headline is 2%, then actually 2 percentage point differences for different households would be quite big. And just a fast snapshot about by income groups as well. So because there's also literature on the inflation heterogeneity or inequality, meaning that who are most vulnerable seem to also be exposed to high inflation. So this has been found for the US data, but we sort of show it here as well. So the lowest income is in red, and we see that actually the peaks here are for them the largest. And for the age groups, Also, we see some differences that the peaks here are largest for the oldest age group. And actually both matter, both income and age, when you look at this heterogeneity. It's not because of the older ones probably have low income and which one is the driving. Because when we move to the regression, we see that actually both dimensions contribute to the higher inflation that they are exposed to. So now going to the next step, to the main results. So what we do, we are using, or we are estimating two-way fixed effects model, the standard workhorse model for banana data, with the individual effects, also time of aggregate shocks. So aggregate shocks should also capture all common shocks that households experience, also the common understanding about the headline inflation. So and now we have the individual inflation here in the regression to see whether this matters on top of that. So we use the standard approach, but we also think or go for the interactive fixed effects, some extension to the two-way fixed effects model, where there's more flexibility about how individuals respond to the aggregation. So that this term here, especially thinking that maybe for the aggregate shocks, including headline inflation, they might respond differently. We should also control for that. We want to control for the time varying unobserved heterogeneity here. So we do this approach as well to see how different results are. So, and I come to the results. So what we find is that individual inflation, that when households experience higher inflation, they will respond with consumption positively. So the consumption increases when they experience higher inflation. And the magnitude is somewhere like 1 percentage point higher inflation means 1.4% higher consumption. Also, with the more advanced ones, we get very similar ones. So we understand that there's nothing wrong with the two-way fixed effects, which is more simple and less computational burden. So in the following, I will go there, follow this model, or we will use continue with this model. But it's good to know then that yes, indeed, that also unobserved time varying characteristics are not affecting our main results. And when we put this non-linear term here, then this one is also positive, meaning that the higher is the inflation, the more households respond to this. Yeah, that's background. That we have also tried the other how we impute, or the first step, or whether we just import the averages from the groups. We still get more or everywhere the positive relationship there. So what could be behind that? So I was saying that I was hinting to the expectation channel. What has been also found in other papers that the expected inflation is the strongest correlated with the current inflation. Other papers are more using that on the headline inflation, but the fact that it's not related to the future inflation or to the lag, that's strongly than to the current one. So that the expectations and current inflation are strongly related. And when we do similar exercise for the Estonian data about using the consumer survey, we also see that the perceived inflation is strongly correlated to the inflation expectations. When going to the age groups or to the different groups, yes, I said that I will get over the time. And so we saw that the inflation can, who were the ones who experienced higher inflation, who are the older ones and the smallest income group. Then we don't see the heterogeneity in the response of consumption here. So that it is the differences in inflation is not amplified by different differences in the consumption response. So if we say that there's a positive relationship, how is then consumption financed? Is the next natural question. we can estimate the models to see whether the increase in consumer loans or different types of loans are related to the inflation that they experience. So we are estimating kind of local model and looking at the odds ratios here for having a new or additional housing loan, new or additional consumer loan, new or additional overdraft or higher overdraft balance. And as we know that not all households or individuals own debt, but it can be related to the preferences or conditions that whether they need, then also this selection issue here is controlled for, the probability to have a debt or being debit. So when we find that inflation is related positively, so when it's over one odds ratios, it's related positively to taking out more consumer loan and taking out more overdraft. So apparently this is evidence that this then consumer loan or overdraft can be used to finance the increased consumption there. And looking at the saving part, where the balances then decline, which can be related to the inflation that they experience, is on term deposits. So that the term deposits decline for those ones who experience high inflation, and we can relate it to the inflation yet. So that. See that this is these are the savings that I used. We were also looking at different investments, stocks, bonds, investment funds. What we found is that the stocks, the balance of stocks, the increase here is related to the inflation that they experience. That's something that hedging against inflation. There's also literature saying that how to try to find other investments more with higher returns when they face individual inflation or higher inflation, and we find evidence for that as well. So and another sort of evidence about this liquidity is important to how they finance is that those ones who have relatively higher assets, say asset to income, how much they have on checking account or term deposits or total, the more money they have on these accounts, the more stronger they respond with their inflation, to the inflation. So this is about the liquidity matters. When they have the money, then they increase or front load their consumption, because then they are able to do that. And when they don't have, this one here means like no balances, then actually, you cannot front load your consumption. And the final angle that we're looking at, seeing that, okay, can we also rate to the other side of how households respond to the other side of their balance sheets, to their liabilities, meaning that whether there is depreciation effect, that with higher inflation, the real value of their liabilities will decline. That could also make their response to inflation higher. We do find some evidence, so interaction term here is illustrating this. We do find some evidence here that those who are indebted, they actually respond stronger to the inflation with their consumption, but that's not that robust, because when going further, seeing that is it housing debt or is it consumer debt, we don't get significant results here. So that's something that we've tried, but it's not that robust. So, and these were the main points that I wanted to deliver here about the heterogeneity, that this we believe is important here, and it is also individual inflation that matters, not only headlines. So this is also something that to think about and to follow, and how consumption is financed by borrowing is one side, and also using the savings there. And we link these results to the adaptive expectations. I didn't show here, but we're also trying or looking at whether not looking only including the current inflation, but the next period inflation or the lags to the model. And we see, yes, that the future inflation is not important or doesn't matter. But that's also because people or households might not be so good in predicting the actual inflation there. But the current inflation is the one which is positively related. And then the lags are negatively rated, sort of like the intertemporal allocation seems to be lagged, that they only, that period when they see inflation, they realize that the inflation increases, they start to front load the consumption, and then the adjustment will come later in the later or following quarters when they decline their consumption. So this seems to be like a lagged response from households. So these are main points from me. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to the questions and details.
Thank you very much, Merike. So I open now for questions. Yes, please. And could you please identify yourself?
Yeah, I'm Elisa Niervi from Bank of Finland. Thanks a lot for this excellent presentation. I was just wondering, what would be your main kind of, or can you take any policy lessons from your analysis, also to the fiscal policymaker, not just monetary policy?
We have thought more about the monetary policy, because what we see that the inflation is high, and then the borrowing might increase. So that's also one thing to consider for the central banks, that when one thinks what will be the distribution mechanism or how inflation is affecting the economy, then actually we also see that there is this credit markets that may be affected. But for the government, so you mean fiscal considerations?
Yeah, is there something?
Well, we could see, well, when we see that the consumption is increasing initially, so that's something that will support also the taxes for government. So in short term, this is also something that will help the government budget, but it's only short term, so that. It's something to have probably in mind, that yes, if we see that there's that the spending doesn't respond straight to the inflation, that there will be like a decline in real spending, but it will follow.
Thanks.
Okay,
I'm Charlie Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance. I noticed on one of your early slides that there were periods of very high inflation, like 13%, and actually negative inflation. Did you happen to separate out the data excluding the periods of negative inflation and see if consumers behaved differently?
I will show this one. Yes, we have looked at that because we also thinking that maybe we can also see that the high inflation or negative inflation period, but unfortunately this negative, it's very specific period, exactly this global financial crisis. So it's more like the main driver, the results are driven by the good times, by high inflation, and not by the disinflation period. So this is more like exceptional there.
Yes, please.
Sorry, that's all very interesting. I was thinking maybe look at it. We put income just as a control variable, but maybe if we look at household adjusted real income deflated by the household inflation. And we can distinguish between wage income and non-wage income, how households the changes in their real income. We're talking about the erosion of real wages. Now households react, so maybe we can It's an extra mile.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that one could look. Yeah, currently we are using this real income there, so we know that. Yeah, if the real income
Real detected by general CPI or by the household?
we have to do, but finally in the paper it's individual CPI. So that getting really controlling for this income effect from inflation. But maybe there is something additional to
Can you distinguish between wage income and capital market
There-
income?
not capital market.
But
So
other non.
yeah. It's okay. Technically, it's a little bit. It's more easier to get to the wage income there, and then you have the other.
Yeah.
The other could have the little bit confused composition there. So I'm not sure whether this part especially can be used as a robust one. Wage income, yes, yeah.
So Michal, Marenčák, Mengus. I have two questions also concerning your account data. So first of all, consumption. Which kind of consumption are we talking about? Can you say something about durable, non-durable? Like you are looking at quarterly data.
We have total consumption here, like from the outflows from the checking accounts. We taking away the mortgages or outflows to the other savings to the other accounts. So this is like a total profit for the total consumption. So we unfortunately, I know that will be like more interesting to see whether it's durable or non-durable. We have tried some estimations of getting whether we can get some extraordinary increases in the consumption, which we could consider as a durable consumption. So we have tried these models. In some specifications, we do get positive or significant results, meaning that we see that the probability to have extraordinary outflows from their accounts, what might be large purchases, that the probability to of this one is higher for those one who experience high inflation, but this is not so robust in our specification, so that we couldn't add it to the presentation and to the paper.
And then follow up in terms of like when you look at how people finance the consumption choices, this consumer credit is interesting. Like which household are driving this? Is it across all? Of course, you are controlling for characteristics, blah blah blah. But like which household are really particularly prone to take up loans to finance their consumption when perceiving high inflation?
Well, currently this is more like for the general or average. Yeah. One could go for digging and looking at the heterogeneity. So of course, there are some which are using borrowing, who are using consumer loans, who's using overdraft, and the others who have savings use their savings. So that this is more like an aggregate results that we get those difference. But of course, you are right that those who take consumer loan probably usually they don't have balances on their accounts, so that's the source that they use. And then there are other households that use other funds to finance their consumption.
But then can you have also a third type of households who are sort of credit constrained who cannot even get a consumer?
Yes, and this is what I was hinting with this one. Is exactly when one doesn't have any balances, then actually also on checking accounts as well, so they're really liquidity constrained and probably don't get the consumer loan either. So that here we don't see the front loading, so that they cannot increase their consumption. It's only when they have the balance then they can increase their consumption. Okay, we have time for one more question, perhaps. If not, then we end right on time. Thank you very much, Merike. And now it's time for Michal Marenčák from. Thank you.
This work is on subjective inflation expectations of households. So, subjective inflation expectations of households are basically the rate at which consumers expect prices to rise in the future. And we all know that in theory, this is a key determinant of which people should take into account when talking about consumption or selling choice. But we also know at the end of the day that it's an empirical question to find out how people react to inflation. And luckily, in the last decade, we have learned a lot about the properties of inflation expectations and their implications for economic choices. So there is really a growing empirical evidence showing that most household decisions indeed depend on inflation expectations, right? Consumption, savings, which kind of mortgage people take up, whether they participate in the stock market and so on. However, now.
It's good.
However, the evidence which we have on inflation expectations prevails primarily for times of low and stable inflation, right? I mean, this is partly by construction because the data which we have stem from times of low and stable inflation. And the following figure is supposed to illustrate. So I'm showing you here the yearly inflation rates in Germany, France, Sweden, UK. So for countries for which we have some evidence on inflation expectations already, since 2000 until May of this year, right? And in the shaded area, you see like the time samples covered by two important papers in the literature: the coauthored paper, Review of Financial Studies, and Phillipe's paper here made by with the Mengus and Gautier forthcoming JM, right? And together with the blue line, which is a time series for Slovakia, which I'm going to look at. And I'm particularly looking at these two papers also because they are using the same data source. So the microdata underlying the European Commission Consumer Survey, right? And you see that for the times which we have some evidence on, Slovakia is kind of mimicking the inflation experience, but we have particularly this kind of surging inflation. So what I'm basically going to do is to ask, so to speak, what you asked for, like when we look at times of surging inflation, what can we learn from it? And in the sense, like to which extent properties change and how implications change. And there is particularly also a period of minor but still deflationary period in Slovakia from 2014 until 2016. So one more time, what I'm doing is that I'm relying on new reliable microdata for Slovakia, featuring quantitative inflation perception and special expectations, and I assess to which extent, if at all, the properties of inflation expectation change and how the implication for economic decision change. And I, of course, discuss the findings in the context of the literature. So first, I confirmed the stylized facts. Inflation expectations are upward biased, dispersed, and volatile. They differ systematically or social demographic groups, right? And they significantly affect the propensity to consume. What I find as novel facts, exactly when studying times of deflation and surging inflation, is that the strength of the positive impact of inflation expectations on propensity to consume is time varying, being much more higher at times of surging and high inflation, and turning not significant or even negative during deflationary times. This might recall the result in Bachmann paper, for example. I also find that outside of the low and stable inflation region, which is 2 to 3% in Slovakia, it is the intensive margin and not the extensive margin which drives the fluctuations of aggregate inflation expectations. What does it mean? It means that if you take a stand on, do you expect inflation or not, against what is your subjective level of expected inflation, it is this expected level of inflation which drives the aggregate inflation expectations. But the question still is, okay, what does it now matter for your consumption choices? And I find out that even it's the intensive margin which drives the variance inflation expectations, it is still the extensive margin which drives the economic choices. And one general observation is that it matter which inflation expectation indicators we look at, and but I'm going to come with that. So first, briefly on the data. So as I said, I'm going to use the microdata from the European Commission Consumer Survey for Slovakia. This is a harmonized survey conducted in all member and as well candidate countries of the European Union. It is supposed to be a monthly survey of repeated cross sections. There are countries such as France with a small panel I mentioned. It is not the case for Slovakia. There are 1,200 households asked monthly in a personal interview during the first 10 days of each month. A question that I'm going to show you on the next slide. I think what is important to highlight is that what is confidential is the microdata, but what is publicly available are the aggregates for different social demographic groups at the country level, but with the exception of quantitative perception expectations. So those data is not available at all. And as I already shown on the slide with the figure, is that this data set has been already commonly used in the literature. And I'm going to look at the sample period from January 2009, when Slovakia joined the Eurozone, until basically today. These are the 12 questions which are asked monthly to the households. Basically, they range from asking about the perception, expectation of individual financial situation, macroeconomic situation in the country, and also the consumer prices. So these are the three important questions I'm going to start with. How do you think consumer prices have developed over the last 12 months? In comparison with the past 12 months, how do you expect consumer prices to develop in the next 12 months? And in view of the general economic situation, do you think now is the right time for people to make major purchases, such as furniture and electrical goods? So this is particularly about durable consumption. Now, about the elicitation of perception and expectations. When you answer the household or as a consumer that yes, indeed, I perceive that prices have changed, or risen a lot, risen moderately, risen slightly, say about fallen, but no. So if you don't answer about the same or don't know, then in the turn you are asked to give a point of state, only then. The same applies to expectations. And concerning the question whether it's the right time to purchase durables, you can answer yes, now is the right time. It's neither the right time or the wrong time. No, the wrong time. No, it's the wrong time. Or no. What we end up with, okay, this is no go to show a 3D picture, but this is actually the distribution of inflation expectations over time in Slovakia over this period. It's supposed to be a little bit appetizing for the complexity, which will come later, but you can clearly see the dark times when in the distribution of inflation expectations change. And this is sort of the flattening which happened during the inflation.
Can you tell us what is the y-axis or x-axis?
Now it would be useful, yeah.
You can slide out there.
Can I let it be like this on the side? It's fine. Yeah. So you will see that. So what I'm like, when we already asked about the y-axis, I'm discarding here the lowest and the highest percentile. Okay, so the lowest 1% and the highest 1%, and otherwise you have everything. Okay. 80%. Sorry. So the lowest 1%. I mean, what I discard. The lowest 1% of lowest inflation expectation and the highest 1% inflation expectations.
Yeah, the big numbers are people expecting 80%.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the question. Yeah. So there are answers. I mean, like you see 80, and there are also people answering to 150. Okay, now it's okay, but before I will come to the distribution in a minute. But before doing so, I think it's really important to give you some flavor for actually whether this survey thing is relevant for real consumption choices. So is the survey evidence a relevant indicator? So what I'm showing you on this figure is this is the share of people answering that this is the right time to purchase durables against the growth rate of real consumption, black solid line, and the consumption growth of durable consumption in the dash black line. So until 2019, after the COVID shock, which you see the drops over here, the correlation was really high. I mean, we were really surprised by seeing it. So it was 0.7. Actually, the correlation was higher with real consumption growth than actually with the durable consumption growth. Now, what you see afterwards is that okay, we have the COVID shocks, and actually you see that the growth rates of real consumption, both of overall consumption and durables, are positive. So we were really puzzled in Slovakia, observing these high inflation rates. We are still the only Eurozone country at the moment with double-digit inflation, that the real consumption actually has not declined so much. Time sample. I'm particularly interested in this potentially time-varying effect of inflation expectation. So I'm going to do exactly what you asked before. I'm going to look at the whole sample, but also split it. And I'm going to split it into the inflation surging period, June 21 until December, deflationary times, the period for which we already observed some expectations to be declining, and so to speak, check all the remaining periods. Some descriptives, if necessary, I will come back to that. What I would like to show now is like how the overall distribution has evolved over time before I show you the main results. So you see here as a blue line is the average inflation expectation in Slovakia from 2009 until today, with a peak at 36% in December. Now, against the dashed black line, which is the actual inflation. So you see that this is the upward bias, which we all know. Then we also see that the mean is always above the orange line, or the red line here, which is the median. So this is the skewness to the right of the distribution. And I also showed the standard deviation. What we have not observed in Slovakia was that skewness to total standard deviation has rise before the mean. So this disagreement argument of rise was not valid in Slovakia. This is the distribution. Okay, and now I try to slice it. And here I'm not discarding anything. So what you see here is the distribution, which I showed you before, since 2019, and I wanted to show you how like the flattening behavior, right? And you see there were indeed households answering the inflation is going to be pretty high over the next 12 months. So, and last descriptive thing, I think what is particularly interesting for Slovakia is to observe that the correlation of perceived and expected inflation is particularly high. So what I'm showing you here are the mean theories for average expected inflation, average expected perception, and the actual inflation. So you see that over time, people really perceive the change in inflation, even though they, on average, expect higher inflation. I particularly like the following figure to show it. You see that actually when I plot perception against expectation, they are actually lying on the 45 degrees line. And only recently this year, we see for the first time some kind of decoupling between perception and expectations. All right. I don't have microdata for other countries, but what I'm showing you here is the correlation of the qualitative expectations and perception using the European Commission survey across all participating countries. So Slovakia is over here, correlation 0.9, which is particularly high. But this observation, the perception and expectations are actually really very much correlated, is everything but uniform across countries, just as a information. And now I'm coming to the main points. So when we ask the question, as Phillipe and others asked in the Phillipe Andrade paper, right, what matters in inflation expectations? Is it this binary decision to expect inflation or not against what is the expected level of inflation, conditionally on expected positive inflation? It's like might be very illuminating. And to address this point, they use the decomposition suggested in Kukk paper on price dynamics. And what we basically can do is, in any period T, we can decompose inflation expectation into the fraction of people expecting non-zero inflation and the average inflation expectation conditionally on expecting non-zero inflation. Then, taking first of the approximation around the average inflation expectation in the period, or the sample period, we can write the mean inflation expectation as sum of the extensive and intensive margin we will in turn use to decompose the variance. Now, these are the results. This paper is taken from the Phillipe Andrade paper of Phillipe, which I showed you for France, and this is the result for Slovakia. So what you see on the left is that extensive margin, so the binary decision to expect non-zero inflation can explain up to 75% of the variance in Slovakia. This is not in France. This is not the case for Slovakia. What I would like to highlight is when you take a look at the Y scale, there are particular differences, right? So you see that this is exactly the time that the inflation or inflation expectations in turn are marginally volatile in Slovakia, but also the average level of inflation is very different. Still, even though this is linear approximation around the average expectation over the period, you see that actually the conservation works quite nice, and you see that actually only at times of low and stable inflation, the blue bar also for Slovakia measure, right? Or explain the measure in the sense that they explain the majority of the fluctuations. Whereas at times, so outside of the stable regions, the red bar, so the intensive margin, which drive the fluctuation. So the question is, if this is the case, what does matter for consumption choices? Is it maybe now the expected level and not the binary decision? Before doing so, I would like to tell you that I referred to the extensive margin so far as the share of people expecting non-zero inflation. But these are basically people expecting positive inflation. So the following figure shows you that the blue line is the share of people expecting non-zero inflation. And the dashed blue line is the share of people expecting positive inflation. They are basically the same. To make the point even stronger, I use a different decomposition suggested by Klenov and Christoph. And I decompose the variance of inflation expectations into the margin driven by expecting positive inflation and negative, and basically 100%, right? So everything can be referred to expecting positive inflation. Consumption and savings. Merike spent already some time to argue that according to theory, you know, like we can explain both consumption increasing as well as decreasing conditional expectations, and it's still an empirical question. Also there, but this is what I want to highlight, that also the empirical literature is not conclusive. So what I'm going to do is next I'm going to take a look at different measures of inflation expectations. So the extensive and intensive margin, as well as the Kunto, Huang, and Weber, a measure of inflation expectations, which is the share of people answering that prices will increase more in the next 12 months than during the last 12 months. So this is their measure of inflation expectations. And I'm going to run a bunch of log regressions to estimate the effect of different inflation expectations on the probability to indicate higher readiness to spend on durables. And I'm going to look to do so by in different samples. As a footnote at this stage, I try different things like not only splitting but also interaction with dummies and so on. To me, this splitting is the most straightforward thing to do at the moment, and to highlight the point. But I'm happy to discuss. So this is the main table. What you see in columns are the results for different time samples, and I'm showing you the results for when I use the Kunto, Huang, and Weber's indicator, then when I'm using the extensive margin, and then the intensive margin. I'm controlling for a, I would say, a rich bunch of demographics, expectations, actual inflation, nominal interest rate. Number of observations are over here. So what you see is that if I regress the Kunto, Huang, Weber measure, if I regress the readiness, the probability to spend on durables on inflation expectation, the Kunto, Huang, Weber, I find a significant and positive impact, right? So this is the probability is going to increase by 3.2 percentage points. Whereas if I just do that for example, for the extensive or intensive margin, I don't find a significant. This changes rapidly if I take a look at the certain inflation rate. There, the effect increases, right, by 1/3. And I also find a strong and positive effect of the extensive margin. At deflationary times, interestingly, this effect vanishes, and according to the extensive margin, it turns even negative. So this is exactly the result, for example, what Bachmann-Berg and Sings find, that in the inflationary times, or actually when the interest rate is constrained, the result about people are decreasing them. In the 2023, it's the extensive margin which seems to be the relevant one. So my takeaway is, or the point I'd like to highlight is that these results suggest highly time-varying effect on inflation expectations. It's also matters which inflation expectation indicator we look at. To me, even more striking is to take a look at the very opposite example. Like, what are people who are saying, I don't know what inflation will be doing, right? So these qualitative questions, one of the possible answers is I don't know. So when you are asked what the inflation will be or how consumer prices are going to develop over the next 12 months, you can also answer don't know. And my hypothesis is that those people who don't know what inflation will be are not going to behave along the Euler equation rationale which we had in mind, right? So I introduced a dummy variable in the same sentence before, which is one when people answered, I do not know the question of inflation expectations. Now my sample is a little bit larger because before I discarded all individuals not answering. But what I found is exactly the opposite result to the indicator of higher inflation expectations, right? So people are answering, I don't know, decrease their readiness to spend, and even more so during times of surging inflation. This in the inflationary time, no effect, and the effect stays negative and significant also in 2020. Right. Before concluding, is that I would like to discuss a little bit also what Phillipe and coauthored are doing is like when we take a look at these inflation expectation indicators, like can they help to forecast or explain actual inflation? So I'm showing you here the indicators of inflation expectations over time. This is the extensive margin. So the share of people answering or expecting positive inflation, as I said, this is the level of expected inflation, conditionally positive inflation, actual inflation, and this is the Kuntos-Hans-Weber indicator of people indicating higher inflation expectations. So what I do here, I'm showing you the OLS results of regressing current inflation on its own leg, and the different inflation expectations measures. This is the average, then the extensive intensive margin, and the Kuntos-Hans-Weber measure. Like this result is exactly the result what Phillipe and Gautier show, that what matters is the extensive margin for actually explaining current inflation. I think that this result, that also the Kuntos-Hans-Weber indicator is has some explanatory power, is interesting, because to compute the extensive intensive margin, you have to have access to microdata. But this is publicly available, right? So also in the Eurosystem, we are now looking at this more particularly. And if I have time, I would like to mention one thing. So here I'm only looking at share of people expecting higher inflation, right? But there are also other answers. Like if I go back to the possible answers, sorry for this, you can now also answer, here we go, the increase more rapidly. So this is what I'm looking at, but also increase at the same rate, increase at the slower rate, right? All these three things together give you actually positive inflation expectations, right? So if I run the regressions and take all of them, I find non-significance, right? So within these three groups, so if I would look at some kind of sub-regimes and so on, the results are driven by the share of people increasing, expecting increasing inflation, which I think is also important as kind of a robustness of to know what is now driving the results. All right, so let me conclude. I've shown you evidence on inflation expectations from a microdata set coming from Slovakia, from the European Commission Consumer Survey. And the two main findings are the following. First, the strength of inflation expectations on the readiness to spend on durables, but actually on the overall consumption when you think about the strong positive relationship between the survey and the actual consumption growth, is that it is state dependent. Right, it's time varying. It tends to be higher at times of high inflation, it turns insignificant or even non-negative, even negative during times of deflation. Outside of the low and stable inflation region, it is the subjectively expected level of inflation which drives the fluctuation in average inflation expectations. But it is still the extended margin which drives the consumption decisions. For people who answer, I don't know, about the expected level of inflation, they don't behave in line with the oil equation, simply saying. And I would say that these results confirm the evidence in the papers I mentioned, the Kunto et al. And Emanuel et al. And then extended further for times of very particularly low, especially deflation and certain inflation. All right, so thank you for your attention.
And now I open for questions. Yes, please introduce yourselves. Yes, you.
Yeah, Simon from American University. Now, in a rising inflation environment, I mean, if all the people expect inflation, be high, still it's reasonable to ask, what's the role of extensive margin? Because I think, if we all agree price is increasing, so what's the role of extensive margin in some way, right?
You are right. I mean, there is a natural upper bound how much extensive margin can explain, right? Exactly. I mean, this is almost trivial to say. This is why. So this is one, right? This is like almost everybody is expecting positive inflation. Fair enough. I mean, for sure. This is all. I don't like the word, but this is trivial to observe. I think what is interesting to ask is everybody is expecting high inflation? Is it still, or does it now matter which level of inflation you expect, right? So conditionally on expecting positive inflation, does the subjectively expected level of inflation matter for your consumption choices, right? And this is, so to speak, what I do in German. But yes, Exactly, there is a natural upper bound, how much extensive margin can inflate.
It's a very interesting paper. This is possibly a dumb question, but I'll ask it anyway. So one thing I didn't quite understand is the sum of the intensive and the extensive margin didn't seem to add up to the overall effect. Was I missing something there?
No, you're right. So there is some remaining part, right? Because this is a linear approximation around the every main expectation. So this is right. If you, you cannot see it so well, but there are some white spaces over here, right? So they don't add up to one. This is the so to speak, the rounding up error. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, this is just because we are considering deviations too far from actually what we organize around.
Yeah, I think you were first. Oh, okay.
I really like the paper. I think it's very interesting. I was wondering on the last exercise you are doing when you're trying to you regress inflation on your measure of. If you think about Slovakia, it's a very small, very open economy now. So in the end, inflation is kind of a exogenous shock now. So I was wondering if are you sure you get the causality in the right direction when you do these kind of things?
I see your point. I think you can think of it as conditional correlations. Let's put it that way, right? I mean, like just to see, like the main exercise is to look at it is the extensive or the intensive margin, and then link to current inflation. Here it is the indicator of the quantitative paper and actual inflation. So this is just to see like have their explanatory power, right? Nothing about really causality, where it's coming from, and so on.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yes, please.
Did the questionnaire, the ECB questionnaire, happen to ask about inflation expectations for longer than 12 months? And was there any change in that you would say significant?
So Slovakia is unfortunately not participating in the consumer expectation survey of the ECB. So I have just the data for the European Commission. And here only inflation expectations after 12 months are released. So I cannot say anything about it, unfortunately.
Yeah, very interesting paper. I have a question on those respondents that say that they don't know. Is that some expression of a subjective uncertainty over future inflation? Can you say something about that? Because it would probably fit very well with what you find that when you're very uncertain about future inflation, you decrease your consumption today.
It's a very good point. So it's pretty small, I know, but these are, so to speak, all the control variables. All the control variables for people indicating high inflation and don't know, right? I'm not measuring uncertainty or confidence per se. Maybe I could come up with some indicator and aggregate some of the other questions to actually. I know that some people at the ECB are looking into it, like how to find out like how confident people are. Like what I can say is just that in terms of the descriptive statistics, I have not found really major differences in the demographic factors or other questions, which could really drive why these people say, okay, I'm going to, I think it's the right time to spend it. Right? But very good point. I will take it with me.
I was wondering, did you also have access to these perceived inflation questions? Because that mitigated the concerns that you just mentioned that inflation is something that is that could, it's another shock and that could affect consumption decision and expectations at the same time. Company for perceived inflation expectation can mitigate the effect of reverse
Yeah, you mean the answers on perceived inflation? Yeah. I mean, okay, they are not controlled for in the regression I showed you, but I was controlling for it, and the results have not changed. But I will include them as particular control. Thank you.
Okay, Merike.
Thank you. And I usually like the slide 8, which was showing this perceived inflation and inflation correlation very strong. So this is something that would actually support my story of my paper. So thank you for that. But I will continue with this remark on this. Don't know who. that could it be also that they are the ones who are less attentive or less thinking about inflation, about whether they want to consume or they don't want to consume, sort of like, and this negative relationship there might not be so much about their actual decisions, but that's okay. I don't know how much information, and I don't care about the patient system. So sort of like this attitude style. It's not easy to control the indication of the results could be also this way.
Maybe I think it's closely related to the confidence question before.
I don't care. This is something else.
I mean, first I was surprised to see that the results are significantly so negative, and even in magnitude more negative during the surging inflation period, right? Yeah, I mean.
Yes.
See that in the language as well. I'm not sure if I noticed, but I know there are questions about what you think about unemployment and reactivity. Do you see what's the correlation? Because for Israel, we were surprised, if I'm not mistaken, that people see inflation as a bad thing, and they say that unemployment is going to be also high, like seeing as a supply shock, not a demand. So did you look at on the general level, or control variable? Or,
no, a good point. So first, I'm controlling for those questions. So people who are saying that they expect unemployment to be high, right? They tend to answer less is the right time to spend on durables. First of all, yeah, I control that. Actually, in Slovakia, what we observe is that people also tend to associate inflation with bad times. So this is the stagflationary view, Erwan Gautier, Kukk, and so on. Therefore, I was surprised to see that, I mean, after a lot of robustness, that this effect of positive inflation expectations on consumption is actually still around. Because when I take a look at the correlation of the question you had in mind and inflation expectation, I see a negative relationship also in Slovakia. But when controlling for it at a very individual level, it decreases the readiness to spend, but still the effect prevails.
One more question.
So what was the fiscal policy in Slovakia during this high inflation? Is it like overspending and everybody is very happy that COVID happened because everybody has a lot of income? Or because I mean, the fiscal side must have been pretty important to explain if people change their view on inflation or not, no?
Yes, so during COVID times, and also the fiscal policy really assured that people kept their jobs. Okay, so when you think about it as a general kind of feeling of safety, like that can be good. Still, what is, I would say, puzzling is that the real wages were declining massively, right? And still, they had not got their durable consumption at last year, 2022. Now, what I think one of fiscal policy is going to be really striking, or its effect in Slovakia, is this. I showed you the decoupling of perception and expectations, and their energy prices in Slovakia are highly regulated. So people probably therefore decouple now expectations and perceptions because of the fiscal policy and how their energy prices are regulated. But in terms of these things, I think this unemployment thing is the strongest channel.
It means that you have very much less precautionary saving, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time to move over. So we have Phillipe Andrade from Most of Trade.
So a motivating chart for this paper is how did you
click on the slides now?
okay, yeah, okay.
And now also the point
Slide, yeah. Good.
Okay. So thanks. Yeah, okay. So the motivating chart for this paper is the following one. So here you have the evolution of debt to GDP ratios in the three main euro area countries. So France, Germany, and And Italy, those levels were normalized to 1 in 2000. Okay, and so you see an increase of this ratio with the Great Recession. Okay, for the three countries, and then afterwards, Germany managed to go back to where they were before, whereas France and Italy did not. And then there's a second surge with COVID. Okay. And the other line that you have here is German CPI inflation. Okay, and so you see that there's this surge of inflation everyone is aware of after COVID, and some people say that this increase in fiscal policies is partly responsible for the inflation surge. Okay, so one of the reasons there are many reasons why fiscal policy can lead to higher inflation, and one of the reasons is obviously that it's an expansionary policy. Okay, so you're going to have positive output gap. But there's another reason that we would like to investigate here, which is related to what is called the risk of fiscal dominance. Okay, and so the risk of fiscal dominance is the fact that the central bank can be constrained or can maybe also choose to inflate to meet the intertemporal budget constraint of the fiscal authority. Okay. And of course, the larger public debt are, then the larger the risk of fiscal dominance can be, because the stabilization of the debt, those larger debt to GDP can be more costly, and also the threat of a default can be more credible. Okay. So that's the story. The transmission. So one of the transmission channel, and this is the transmission channel that we have tested, is that under fiscal dominance, the central bank is expected to deviate from price stability. Okay, and so if you start to think that this will happen, then your inflation expectation, agents' inflation expectation could increase, including in the long term, and then in standard models, inflation expectations have an impact on inflation. Okay, so this is the channel that we want to investigate. Okay, so we want to provide some empirical evidence of this impact of fiscal policy on inflation expectation, and whether this is related to the view that people have on fiscal policy. Okay, so what we do, we use a survey of households. It is a survey maintained by the Bundesbank, and we ask them some questions that are related to fiscal issues and fiscal dominance. Okay. So first of all, we ask people in the survey whether they expect some form of public debt funding constraint. And here we have two separate scenarios. One that is really related to the scenario that I've described, which is that the central bank is going to be constrained because they want to help, or they need to help fiscal authorities in the euro area. So that's the constraint on this scenario. And another one, which is also related, is a scenario where there's sufficiently significant funding constraint, public funding constraint, so that there's going to be a default in the euro area. Okay, so there's the two scenarios that we ask questions about. Then we're going to have a look at the determinants of beliefs on public debt funding constraint, looking at individual characteristics, and also how their beliefs on this funding constraint are related to other macroeconomic views. And eventually, we're trying also to, assess how fiscal news can affect household debt and inflation expectation. Okay, and of course, this is something that is challenging in terms of identification, because there are shocks that could, change both at the same time the inflation expectation and the fiscal expectations of households. So what we do is to rely on this, quite standard method now of conducting a randomized control treatment, where we provide information randomly to different groups of people on future debt to GDP ratio for several euro area countries. Okay, actually for Italy, Germany, and France. And then we look at the impact this treatment had on the expected euro area debt to GDP expectation of households and their long-run inflation expectation in Germany. That's the end of the slide. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, I think I got it. Okay. Okay, so what do we find? So we find that a large majority of households expect euro area funding constraint, and they expect either a constraint on that the ECB monetary policy is going to be constrained, but also that there's a high chance of a default in the euro area. Okay, and so what is interesting here is that the fiscal dominance scenario, the fact that monetary policy is going to be constrained, is not always viewed as a substitute for default. Okay, so the two can work together in the mindset of these households. So the basis on fiscal capacity on these funding constraints varies with some individual characteristics, for instance, asset holding, so you can think of exposure to risk, some demographics, but also something that is interesting here is, and that we quite like to emphasize right now, is that they depend on political preferences. Okay. So you can think of maybe some people have different views of what is going to happen, different narratives of what is going to happen for given the same macroeconomic outlook. And then when they expect people that expect constraint on fiscal capacity have usually higher inflation expectation, lower output growth expectation, and they expect also higher taxes. So it's a bit, reminiscent of the discussion that we had before, like inflation is associated to bad news, okay? And also, bad fiscal news. And then when it comes to the treatment, we see that debt and inflation expectations are updated after fiscal news. The average impact on long-term inflation expectation is positive and significant, but not very large. This effect varies with the perceived likelihood of a fiscal constraint. Okay? And so the higher probability of fiscal constraint is perceived to be inflationary, okay? But this is not something that is perceived as a result of a constrained monetary policy. Okay? So fiscal issues is something that leads to more, to more inflation. But it's in the mindset of these people, this is not the result of monetary policy that is going to help the government. All right, so in terms of literature, we connect to, we think, three literature. So the literature that emphasizes that the government budget concern matters for inflation. So starting with the unpleasant arithmetic of Sergeant Wallace, and then the literature on the so-called FTPL literature initiated by Phillipe. There's not much, I mean, most of this literature is a theoretical literature. There's not much empirical evidence. You have those, very well-known papers by Bianchi, Melosi, and now more recently Bianchi, Facchini, Melosi. They provide, evidence that this is the case, that fiscal policy matters for inflation, but they provide, indirect macro evidence. So here somehow we provide direct evidence of a causal impact using individual data. So we are not the first to use a FCT to assess how households understand fiscal policy and how it has an impact on their expectation and their inflation expectation. There is a paper by Cohen, and Weber, who shows that some fiscal news increase household expect inflation. So what we do compared to them is that we investigate the effect of the prior that people have on fiscal dominance scenarios, type of scenarios. And we also highlight this imperfect understanding of the fiscal monetary policy interactions in the mindset of households. And then the last literature is the literature that shows that long-run inflation expectations vary over time and that there's some risk of de-anchoring. And here what we emphasize is that fiscal policy can affect long-run inflation expectations of households. Okay. So before going to the data and the survey, let's think of, you know, the intertemporal government budget constraint and what happens after an exogenous increase in the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so you can have 4 main scenarios, and of course, a conjunction of those 4 scenarios. So you can have more inflation to, you know, meet the budget constraint after this initial shock. You can have a haircut on debt, so that's going to be a default. You can obviously have a fiscal consolidation, so an increase in the present value of future surpluses. And then you can have also, you know, a very nice scenario of that we call self-financing, which whereby, you know, you have higher growth rates, and therefore that helps you to finance the initial increase of the GDP. Okay, so what we want to emphasize here is that with the 2 first scenarios, you need to erode the nominal value of debt because there are some fiscal constraints. And the 2 other, the 3 and 4th scenario, are scenarios where somehow the fiscal resources can be increased. Okay, and so here, you know, we're gonna ask some people what they see about those 2 first scenarios. Okay. Okay, so the survey that we are using is this Bundesbank online panel of household survey. There's a regular part of that survey, so it's a monthly survey providing information, I mean, like a lot of this survey on socio-demographic characteristics, okay, age, gender, and so on and so forth. There's also a lot of information on individual macro expectations. So there's information on inflation at various horizons, also on employment, growth, taxes, and interest rates, I should add. And then there's also some variables on their individual expectations, like income expectations or consumption decisions in the future. We are not using those variables so far in the current version of the paper. And you can also add some special module, and we added a special module in November 2021. So that's right after the German elections, where we provided so we conducted this, we implemented this randomized control treatment, giving treatment on the fiscal stance in France, Italy, and Germany. And also we have some other treatments that are related to monetary and fiscal policy interaction. I'll be more specific in 1 or 2 slides. We asked people after the treatment whether they perceive that there's going to be some form of fiscal constraint. So again, either fiscal dominance or default. And then we have a post-treatment measure of expected medium run euro area debt to GDP and German long run inflation. Okay, so that's the structure of the survey. So we are, I must say that we are in the special module. You are a bit constrained of what you can do because you cannot add a lot of questions, and you have to put the special modules after the regular module. So you cannot, you know, observe an employment or stuff like that after the special module. This is why we have, you know, limited views on variable after the treatment. Okay, so what are the treatments? So first of all, there's this fiscal new treatment or fiscal treatment, which is the following. So this is, you know, true information. We say that country I, so a country can be France, Germany, and Italy. Government debt is currently, we are providing the amounts. And then the ratio of growth to GDP. And then we also provide the forecast of what it will be according to the European Commission. Okay, what it will be in 2024, so 3 years after the survey was conducted. Okay. So this is for the fiscal treatment. We have 2 other treatments that, as I was saying, are related to the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So one is a treatment that we call ECB purchases. So we provide some household with information pertaining to the amounts that the ECB, the amount of government debt that the ECB already bought. We provide the the amount and also the share of government debt that has been booked by the ECB. And then a treatment that we used to call Weidmann, and maybe going to be more like a credibility treatment. So it's a statement that Jens Weidmann, who was still the president of the Bundesbank at the time, I mean, when he gave the interview, that emphasized that the ECB should not be pressured into pursuing other objectives such as guaranteeing minimum returns on certain types of investment or helping governments with payment problems. So like, a statement that there's no way that the ECB is going to abide to fiscal authority constraints. And then there's no treatment for the control group, there's no treatment. Okay. After those treatments, we have two questions on the probability of fiscal constraints. So one is the fiscal dominance scenario type of constraint. So within the next 5 years, the ECB will be unable to sufficiently raise its key rates to control inflation, as this would make it too expensive for one or several of the euro area countries to finance their government debt. Okay? So it's really something that has to do with the interest rate decision linked to government constraint. Okay, and then you can answer, you also can give qualitative assessment, okay, to this scenario. And the second scenario is the default in the euro area. So within the next 5 years, at least one country in the euro area will be unable to repay its government debt on time. And then likewise, we can provide qualitative assessment of this, of the likelihood of this attached to this scenario. Post-treatment variables. So we have something on the medium run debt at the euro area level. We said that at the present level, the debt to GDP ratio for the euro area was at the time 100%. In your opinion, to what level will the ratio of euro area government debt to GDP rise or fall in the next 5 years? Okay. And then there's something on the inflation rate. So what value do you think the inflation rate or deflation rate will take on average over the next 10 years? Okay, so that's for a long horizon. Okay, so some results. First of all, this is how people think about the fiscal constraint scenarios. As you can see, they put a lot of probability on the fact that the scenarios are very likely. Okay, so almost 40% of the people surveyed think that there's a very likely chance that there's going to be a default in the euro area. And they also, there's somehow 30% or 1/3 that think that it's very likely that the ECB is going to be concerned. Okay. So what is also interesting is that the combination of the two is almost 20%. Okay, and so and that's also true if you even more so if you include the people who answer that it's likely rather than very likely. You see that most of the math is in this four cells. Okay, so they don't really think that it's going to be the ECB is going to help, and so therefore there's going to be no default. So they think that it's going to be probably the two together. Right? So, but so you can maybe think of this as again people having negative perceptions or associating negative scenarios together, like inflation comes with low growth. So it's a form of okay. So what are the characteristics that influence? So I should say okay. Sorry. So what are the characteristics that influence those scenarios? So one thing that I should say here, and that might be a source of a concern for you. So we ask these questions after the treatment, and so of course, is this something that is affected by the treatment? I'm not reporting the results here, but if you do the regression, the treatment has no impact on the answer to those questions. So you can think of this as priors that are not affected by the treatment. So now those priors are related to several variables. So for instance, if you're a debt mortgager, if you're a debt holder, here it's non-mortgage debt, you have a lower probability than the other people or the other household to think that it's very likely that there's going to be that the ECB is going to be constrained. So one way to think about this is that those debt holders will benefit from more inflation, and so maybe they're that's a good scenario for them, and they're lowering the probability of a good scenario for them. And that's a bit the opposite for securities holders, right? So securities holder is that every securities, you can think that they'll be happy with higher interest rates. And so the good scenarios for them is that ECB raise interest rates. So a fiscal dominant scenario is a bad scenario, and put a higher probability on this bad scenario than the other one. Something that I was mentioning and that is quite striking is that the party you voted for in the election affects your beliefs. And the easiest way to think about that, so here the reference party is the party who won the election, the SPD. And so if you look at the column where none of the two scenario default and fiscal dominance are considered to be very likely, you see that every other party has a negative impact. So they think that there's a lower probability that none of this scenario will happen than compared to people who voted for the SPD. Okay, so you can see that those people are unhappy, or they fear that the party that did not vote for might do crazy things or whatever. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at how those perceptions about fiscal constraint scenario affect is related to their macroeconomic, other macroeconomic expectations. So here we are looking at inflation and interest rates, and you see that for when you distinguish household between according to the probability that they put on this fiscal dominance scenario, you see that, of course, there are some differences, but when it comes to inflation, the numbers are roughly the same. Okay, so if you compare people that think that this scenario is very likely compared to neutral, you see that again there's some differences, but it's roughly the same. Whereas if you look at the expected saving interest rates on savings, there is really a lower value for people who think that the fact that the ECB will not be able to raise rates is very likely. Okay, so they understand that this scenario really implies that interest rates are going to be lower, but it doesn't seem to be very inflationary. When it comes to the default in the euro area, it's a bit the opposite, in the sense that there's not very much, no big difference when it comes to the interest rates. Okay, but people who think that it's very likely that there's going to be a default in the euro area are also people are clearly higher expected or perceived inflation than the others. And when you look at other variables like economic growth, so here is the share of people who think that growth is going to increase and tax is going to increase. You see that people that put a very large probability on the fact that the ECB will not be able to raise rates have, roughly speaking, the same economic growth or forecast than others. They expect higher taxes, and when it comes to default in the euro area, people who think that this scenario is very likely have a much more pessimistic view on growth forecast than others, and they also expect higher taxes. Okay, so maybe you can think that, and as was discussed, that people that think that that put a large probability on these two scenarios are people that are pessimistic no matter what. And so, and this is maybe what is going to make them more, as we said, high inflation is something that is associated to a bad state of the world. So is this what we have here? So we conducted this regression to check that, the probability that you put on these two scenarios are not just redundant with pessimism about the macro outlook in general. Okay, so here you have the impact of thinking that default is very likely, but not fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance is very likely, but not default, and default is and fiscal dominance are very likely on perceived inflation expectation in 1 year, and inflation expectation in the long run. Okay, so the important thing here is that you have a positive impact, and the important thing is what is not shown on this table, which is that we are controlling for all the other macro forecasts that we can get for this individual. So meaning that, you know, even if you control for, say, growth forecast, interest rate forecast, unemployment forecast for these individuals, there is something that is specifically attached to your views on the fiscal issues that, you know, increase inflation, in particular long-term inflation. Okay, so that's not a causal statement. It's just, you know, at this stage, just exploration. So let's move to something that's more causal now, using the treatments. And so what we have here, in terms of time, let's focus on the second column. What we have here is the reaction of debt to GDP expected by an individual in reaction to the various treatment. Okay, so the various treatment that we have here are the treatment for France, fiscal stance, Italy, Germany, and then the two, you know, monetary / fiscal policy interaction. Okay. So you see that the information on France debt to GDP increases the euro area debt to GDP forecasted by individuals, okay, by 1 percentage point. That's almost the same for Italy. And then for Germany and the other two treatments, it decreases those forecasts. One of the reasons why this is the case is that for Germany, you know, the forecast gives you a number that is below what the euro area debt to GDP level is currently. So it's below 100%, whereas it's not the case for France and Italy. So this is probably why, you know, you have this asymmetry. Okay, so the fiscal news has some impact on, you know, what people expect the debt to GDP ratio will be in the euro area. Now, when you look at the impact of this fiscal news or treatment on expected inflation, you see that the two treatments that increase debt to GDP ratio in the euro area level also have a positive impact on long-run inflation expectation, okay, for German also. Okay, and there's no impact for significant impact associated with the treatment who, you know, make people more optimistic about future debt to GDP in the euro area. Okay. Last thing, and one thing that we really want to emphasize is that, so what is driving these aggregate results depends on your views, your prior views on, you know, whether you think there's a high chance that there's going to be a default in the euro area or a high chance that there's going to be fiscal dominance. And surprisingly, at least to us, what is really interesting is that the people who are driving the results are the ones who think that there's a very likely chance that there's a default in the euro area. Okay, so if you look at people that think that it's very likely that there's a default in the euro area, you see that the impact of the treatment on expected debt to GDP is positive, and it's not positive, not significant for the others. And this is also where you see the impact on expected inflation. Okay, so that's really those people who are driving the result. Now, if you look at people with different views on the likelihood of the fact that the ECB is going to be constrained, that's the opposite. Okay, so the people that have positive impact are either people who think that there's a low chance, relatively low chance compared to very likely, that the ECB is going to be constrained. And this is also where you see the impact on expected inflation. Of course, here we're mixing a bit of the two. So the people that think that there's a very large likelihood that there's going to be a default are also in this set, right? But what is interesting is that it's really when you decrease the probability of a fiscal dominance scenario, you see more of an impact on expected inflation. Okay. Okay, so let me wrap up. We show that German households expected some form of fiscal concern at the time of the survey. This varies with, political preferences. So maybe you can think of this as people being exposed to different types of narratives, which affect their views about the macroeconomy. The fiscal news, increasing household expected debt ratio, also increased the long-run inflation expectation, which is consistent with the fiscal dominance logic. These point to a risk of potential de-anchoring attached to higher debt to GDP ratio. Yet, this impact is also mitigated by the fact that there are some households that are, less concerned with fiscal constraint, and they do not associate fiscal news with more debt and inflation. And of course, you can see that maybe over time, this probability can vary, and the risk of de-anchoring might, vary over time. And finally, the households mapping between debt and inflation is not associated with a perceived constrained monetary policy. Okay, in the mindset of this household, and this raises what we think is a potential policy challenge in the sense that large public debt could lead to higher inflation expectation for the general public, even when the central bank is need to be unconstrained, not to react to the fiscal. Thank you.